All right, so welcome everybody to, well, I should say good evening, those of you in the eastern coast of the United States, like I am, or good afternoon if you're on the West Coast, or good morning if you're in Asia, or wherever you're joining us from. We welcome you to this iteration of the Modern Japan History Association's new books on Japan book talk series, which we'll be talking about Professor Sayaka Chatani's A Nation Within, North Korean Zainichi in Postimperial Japan, which he did in collaboration with KumHee Cho. And start with the presentation from some remarks from Professor Chani about the book and her research process and how she came to this topic. And then Professor Yumi Kim will be providing some comments and questions following that. So I'll go ahead and introduce first our speaker and then our discussant. So Professor Chatani is an associate professor of history at the National University of Singapore, which teaches modern East Asian history. She's a multilingual social historian of the Japanese Empire and its aftermath. So her first book, which many of you in the virtual audience may also be familiar with, is A Nation Empire, Ideology and Rural Youth Mobilization in Japan and Its Colonies, which came out with Cornell University Press in 2018. And that compares the experiences and mindsets of young men under imperial mobilization in the countryside of northern Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and Okinawa. And we really see the multilingual aspect of her work there, which was quite impressive. And her equally impressive second book, which will be discussed today, of course, is A Nation Within, which delves in the internal dynamics of the pro-North Korean Zainichi community and proposes a new perspective for studying post-war Japan. So I look forward to hearing more about that, as well as hearing comments from our discussant, who's very graciously agreed to provide comments on Dr. Chatani's presentation, and that's Professor Yumi Kim, who is a historian of Japan and Korea at the University of California, Berkeley, with research and teaching interests in cultural and social histories of women, gender, medicine, religion, colonialism in Japan, Korea, and the Asian diaspora in the 19th, 20th centuries. Her first book, which won a Fairbank Prize, is Madness in the Family, Women, Care, and Illness in Japan. And she's currently working, and I'm very excited to hear about this. I would love to maybe moderate to MGHA, talk about this in the future. We'll see. On a second book about the persecution of female shamans in the outermost edges of the Japanese Empire. The annexed islands of Okinawa, the remote areas of northeast Japan, Tohoku, and the colonized territory of Jeju Island in what is now South Korea. And she's thinking about the ways to center the experiences of these persecuted women, especially their ways of knowing and relating with earthly and divine realms that sustain their communities in precarious times of colonialism and war. So again, thank you so much, Professor Chatani and Professor Kim, for joining us, and to KumHee Cho for working, Dr. Cho for working with them, working with Sayaka on this great project, and we'll go ahead and proceed.
Well, thank you, Joseph, and thank you, Professor Yumi Kim, for agreeing to be my discussant. And thank you, everyone, for coming to this talk, wherever you are. I see some of the familiar names here, so hi. So this book, A Nation Within North Korean Zainichi in Post-Imperial Japan, is mainly about Zainichi Korean community around an organization called Chongryon, or Chosen Soren in Japanese. And Chongryon is known as a pro-North Korean organization or de facto North Korean embassy in Japan. The organization ran and still runs Japan-wide bureaucracy and governing divisions, and used to run hundreds of schools. It still has more than 100 schools, credit unions, insurance companies, scientists association, and whatnot. It's a very complete governing organization. Um, the organization itself, in the current form of Chongryon, was established in 1955. And when it was established, the leaders declared that we Koreans are North Korean nationals, DPRK nationals residing abroad. So we would stop meddling with Japanese politics. And indeed, they retreated from Japanese leftist movements, which they participated passionately in the past 10 years. And rather, they focused on Korean and Zainichi politics ever since. And this is probably why we don't really hear or see Chongryon in Japanese political history today. And my assertion is that we should. Anyway, the large part of this book is about how the community was formed, not the organization itself, but the community was formed, sustained, and strengthened, and how it changed over time. And the book covers a period of roughly between 1945 and the 1980s, but it also mentions a little bit about the crisis in the 1990s and onward. And at the end of the book, in conclusion, I kind of look back at Japanese society as well. As you can tell from this cover, I worked closely with KumHee Cho. She's present in the audience here today. So if you want to ask questions, she can probably answer, unless her child wakes up. She grew up in the Chongryon community and Chongryon family. She went to Chongryon schools and worked for one of the credit unions. Her grandfather was a famous Chongryon cadre and regional leader, Cho Chanje. So here are his photographs. It's Cho Chanje here, and this is then he's giving a speech in the convention at the Hyogo prefecture Chongryon, I guess, meeting. So he was equivalent of a Chongryon governor of Hyogo prefecture, which is one of the most powerful regions in Japan among Chongryon people in the 1960s, which was also a heyday of Chongryon's political power. So KumHee and her family became my entry point into the community and its history. So before, I want to mainly talk about the research process and what I thought and maybe what KumHee thought. However, this is a book talk. I want to introduce the book itself too. So maybe the first half I will discuss how it's structured. So this is the table of contents and start with my essay and KumHee's essay, preface and prologue. And these essays can actually serve as primary sources, actually, written by a contemporary Japanese person and a third generation Zainichi Chongryon women. And these are the essays discussing how we felt about the community. And in my essay, I wrote about how I worked with KumHee. KumHee wrote about her memories of her grandfather, her upbringing, and her research and her feelings about this research. So I heard this later from my acquisition editor at Stanford University Press. He read these two essays when I submitted my full manuscript, and he cried. So I feel that maybe your students might like these essays, if not the rest of the book. Anyway, so introduction will lay out the basic background of the community, including the colonial history and overall argument, which I will try to come back to. Chapter 1 is a little bit different from the rest of the book because it's a summary of institutional history from the League of League of Koreans, Minjeon and Chongryon. And so it covers approximately the 2 decades after 1945. But I actually start this chapter with an anecdote of a Japanese communist activist youth of the 1960s because he shares the same question that I had, which is why did leftist Koreans not work together with Japanese activists of the 1960s? So I try to answer this question by going through the institutional history and their surroundings, international politics, and their political visions. And the second and third chapters, Donne and Hakyo, go into the source and the origin of the community sentiment. Donne is, in this context, it means Korean slums or Korean neighborhoods in Japan, and Hakyo is schools, Korean schools. Both places were under severe attack of the Japanese police. So Koreans fight against Japanese race and Japanese police race to protect their spaces created a sense of autonomy and a sense of territory and territoriality. So this sense of territory, I think, was very important to continue on and build their confidence as a decolonized people. So the interesting thing for Chongryon is that that sense of autonomy, the place of autonomy, continued in the school compounds. So even today. So again, it's not just about instructions or ideology and the language they spoke inside the Hakkyo compound, but the place itself, the physicality was also very important in my view. Now, chapter 4 is about women's union. Nyomen is the women's union. I deliberately introduce women activism before men cadres work. This is deliberate. But men cadres work is my focus in the chapter 5. This is partly my feminist take, but it is also a logical transition in my bottom-up description of the community. Women were the fabric, still are the fabric of the community. The women's union has been the closest to each household. So talking with women union cadres revealed a lot of the daily life struggles and gender dynamics to us. And they also defined the Korean culture at the grassroots level, and they balanced between the socialism and the Korean culture and what's acceptable, not acceptable. And so they are very extremely important for community building. That said, chapter 5 about Ilkun are cadres, and chapter 5 is also critically important in understanding the community because cadres tied the community and the political organization or the state, the homeland, North Korea. And the 1960s, the decade and maybe afterwards, was Chonryon's heyday. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Chonryon went through a huge political turmoil and upheaval, an equivalent of a cultural revolution within the organization. So this chapter discusses what happened during this period and also tries to understand the grave implications to larger society, individual families, and also Japanese society in this chapter. Chapter 6 focuses on, okay, I'm sorry, I forgot to show some of the photos. These are photos of Tonne, of Hakata, as of the 1960s. Here are some of the photos of Hakkyo schools. This is Nyomen in Hokkaido. Some of them are Japanese women. Oh yeah, let's stop here for now. So chapter 6 focuses on Japanese wives and mothers. Actually, they are not a small demographic group. In some regions, 1/3 of the families or even half of the families had a Japanese woman in the family as a wife or a mother. And their experiences varied a lot from person to person, but I felt that their perspectives and their experiences within the community explain how the community functioned very well. And I wanted to show how these women and how the community dealt with the contradictions of the notion of ethnic purity or decolonization goal or Japan's national rebuilding of the post-war period. So chapter 9, Bridges to North Korea. This chapter focuses on the repatriation movement which started in December. What movement itself started in the late 1950s or earlier, but the actual program started in December 1959. And thanks to Professor Tessa Morris Suzuki's work, we probably know a lot more about this aspect of Chonryon society. So my chapter, though, focuses more on the Chonryon side of the story and how the community viewed the whole process as the core of the community experience. And it was the start of their new story rather than the end of the story. Many Japanese audiences or even English-speaking audience tend to see the repatriation movement as the end of the story. So they went, and that was the beginning of the tragedy on their end. But for the community remaining in Japan, the whole new relationship with the homeland started with the repatriation movement. For example, in the 1970s, they started to be able to make short visits to the homeland. And in the 1980s, Zainichi businessmen in Japan could start having business relationships and invest joint ventures in North Korea. So they started to have a very intimate relationship with excuse me, North Korean society. They started to have intimate knowledge of North Korean villages, remote areas, economy and bureaucracy and politics. So, so this chapter sort of tries to expand our geographical understanding of Zainichi society itself. Now, chapter 8 is a very short essay about the 1990s and how the crisis came about, the collapse of the credit unions and corruption cases, and also the missile launches by the home government and kidnapping. So in 2002, Kim Jong-il admitted that North Korean agents kidnapped Japanese citizens back in the 70s and 80s. That was 2002. So around that time, and it's even continuing today, Chongryon organization and the community were facing massive crisis. So this chapter, a short summary, is about that. And conclusion is a totally different beast, and it's a very academic synthesis and reflections, historiographical reflections on Japan. And this is a proposal on how to think about post-imperial history of Japan. So it talks about the legal system, talks about the academic conceptions of Asia versus Korea and wartime responsibility versus imperial responsibility. But also, I tried to understand the implications of Chonryon's large presence in reality, but also its absence from Japanese official politics, right? So one of the proposals, for example, is to say that the Japan's 55 system, 고지원엔 타이세, uh, in which the LDP, Jiminto, would dominate the Japanese politics for decades. I would say that Chonryon's retreat from the Japanese politics, leftist movements, might have contributed to the long presence of a prominence of the LDP rule. Anyway, so again, this is a proposal. So I'm really curious to see how other Japan historians would conceive my idea. So I'm happy to receive critiques on this. Now, since KumHee is here too, I want to sort of share how this research started and how it went. Okay, so KumHee and I were not close friends before this research process started. We knew each other from the grad school. We were in Columbia. I was probably 5 or 6 years ahead of her. I graduated first. So we had a chat over coffee, and I learned about her dissertation topic. But then I graduated, and I had a workshop held in New York in 2018. So I came back to give a talk about my first book, and KumHee was there. And then she told me that she quit the program. She quit the PhD program. So I was very saddened, and I was like, who's going to write about Chonryong? Because no one can. And KumHee obviously appeared to be saddened as well. She appeared, at least to me, that she wanted to do this research, but circumstances did not allow that to happen. So I just finished my first book. I had a startup grant in US in Singapore, so I decided to hire her as a research assistant and proposed to her that maybe we do the research together a little bit. And so that's how it started in 2018. And my original vision was that we do a bit of oral history together, and KumHee, then KumHee might feel satisfied about what she can find out, and she will write her own stuff, and maybe I'll write one or two articles out of it. And so that's the end of the story, I thought. However, when we started, so this is one scene this is before taking a ferry to Busan. When we started, it was just, it was a huge, it just snowballed into a huge project. And we basically became really close friends. And partly because we came from the same hometown in Hyogo Prefecture, and we spoke the same dialect in Osaka, in Kansai-ben. And when you start speaking in Kansai-ben, that's when two women would become just non-stoppable, right? So we just became clicked together. We decided to work much longer. I got another grant, so we continued on. This is KumHee showing some of the memorabilia from her grandfather. This is Kim Il-sung Omega watch. There's this is there's signature by him on it. Um, so that's how it started. And the first place that KumHee brought me to was the Korea University Chosun-daehakyo, which is sitting at the outskirts of Tokyo. And I don't know if you have been there, but I was very nervous stepping into campus. I'm obviously a Japanese citizen, so going into that sort of, the campus felt wrong, and I didn't know how to behave. And surely the first meeting with the head of the research center was very formal. They brought us to a meeting room in the library, and I think he told us what we are supposed to do and what we were not supposed to do. And it was very, formal, and there are many rules. But KumHee had a old friend there from high school, and he's a professor in Joseon-daehakyo, and he was like, "Oh, don't worry about this, and once you get to know them, it will loosen up." And then surely, after a few hours of archival research at the center, it became so homely. They were serving tea and having chats, and we went for meals, and had coffee time, and we had jokes, and KumHee even had a nap in the research center, and they took care of us basically while we were at Chosun-daehakyo. And so this is where I also felt that there is outside image of Chongryon and inside feeling of Chongryon are two completely different things. Oh, this is Joseon-daehakyo's gate. So after that, I didn't even need KumHee to come with me to continue on the archival research. Um, so they always welcomed me. And KumHee did a fantastic job in creating the network and finding more and more interviewees. So it was for me, so I just needed to go be there, but KumHee maybe worked really hard to make a connection to the new people. And we had started with KumHee's friends, parents, and school teachers. And then from there are more friends of theirs willing to speak with us. So we had access to Chongryon members widely across Japan. But also we tried to find people who left the community, or even those who work for Mindan, became officials in Mindan organization. The Mindan is the pro-South Korean organization, supposed to be a political rival. But so uh, I was very fortunate that KumHee also could take care of the sort of follow-up, thank you notes and follow-up messages, emails, and phone calls and whatnot. And she could also drink. I couldn't. So that was a really important part of the research process and interviews. She could keep up with their soju drinking, whereas I couldn't. So all these things really come down to the ability that KumHee could connect very well with many, many old people. So this whole journey, I tagged along with KumHee. I'm sure it was also a transformational experience for KumHee too, because the KumHee I knew before the research and after the research were also very different too about her sense of protection, like protecting the community got stronger, I feel. But also this journey was a constant self-reflection. Obviously, oh no, any research is a self-reflection, but this also really challenged my understanding of nationalism or diaspora or Japanese society in general. So I'm just giving you here some of the photos that I really liked. So these are women in Chongryon in marching and dancing. This photograph I felt really incredible. This is from 1979. This is when Chongryon people started to make shorter visits to North Korea. And this is a scene from a ferry. So when they are landing, this is what they saw on the North Korean side. So people welcoming. Anyway, so what surprised me? So I'll just give you, so I mean, individual lives are all surprising and archival materials are all surprising too. But this is in general really shocked me at the beginning. First of all, I was very shocked that I didn't even know how much I didn't know. And I thought relatively speaking, I'm a Japanese progressive, and I have read a few books on Zainichi Koreans, a general history of Zainichi Koreans. I've read a few writings about Kansanjun, maybe some of you did too. But once I started to do research and start to talk to people, it was a totally different world that I didn't know. So I was very ashamed of that fact too. But also, it was not just me. People in general are curious, but they just don't have access to the information or have a very grave misunderstanding. So it was really surprising to me that how much I didn't know. And even some of you probably heard the news about Korean schools these days under attack and being not receiving the subsidy from the government these days. And students and alumni are protesting against the government measures. So the best scenario I can imagine that the people know about this news and they imagine Chongryon or Korean schools to be very, very marginalized small group of people. And that was also quite different historically. So another thing that really surprised me and probably surprised KumHee too was the scale of the community and also the scale of mobilization in the 1960s and 70s and the depth or grassrootsness of the community. And I couldn't believe how quickly she could find interviewees in any city because the network is still strong. In official numbers, the community shrunk a lot, but I was surprised that the sort of you can trace the former members or the sort of, the other people very quickly if there's an insider collaborating with you. Okay, so another thing, this is quite logical. I shouldn't be surprised by this, but at the beginning, I was also very surprised how close the community felt to North Korea. And it's not just the feeling, they were close to North Korea. For example, people no this is not just about older generation, the first or second generations who've had a stronger feeling for the homeland, but third and fourth generations like my age or KumHee's age, they have children and on Facebook page they were mentioning like, oh, my son wants to do a summer camp in Pyongyang this summer, but I don't know if I can afford it. And then his friend would say like, oh yeah, my son went to a summer soccer camp last year and it was really good. And the Pyongyang, North Korea was really close to them. So I was quite, struck by that geographical conception. Another thing, in general, when we did interviews, I was struck by the confidence they have as a Chonyeon member or Korean person. Um, it's quite clear and very refreshing. And they also have a very unique, sharp sense of political surroundings. So they had sharp critiques about Japanese politics, North Korean politics, and the world affairs, and which was uh, very different from what I would feel in Japanese society. I'm a very political person, but I don't speak about politics with my Japanese friends. I don't expect for like an owner of a coffee shop or owner, a butcher would have opinions, strong opinions about Japanese politics, but they do in Chonryong. So that was really refreshing and actually very fun for me to talk about various social and political issues with them. And many of them have a great sense of humor, which was also surprising to me. They even sometimes have a very dark sense of humor about North Korea too. So these are probably very normal to KumHee and people who know Chonyeon. But they as from coming from outside, these are really striking to me. Now, given that, I just want to summarize what this book is trying to do here as a form of conclusion. So one is that I'm trying to explain the Chonyeon community, the Chonyeon organization, and what they did as the massive decolonization movement that took place in Japan, but also it has very unexpected consequences to themselves, but also to Japanese society as well. And I detailed many of the unfortunate consequences in the book as well. And the second goal that I had was to map the large volume of information about Zainichi and individual accounts by Zainichi people. This probably needs some explanation. So once you start, when you are interested in Zainichi Koreans, there are actually a lot of writing, especially in Japanese. But first of all, in English writing, the emphasis among these writings has been diversity, right? And then identity crisis, a complexity of identities. So often the case we know that there are multiple identities, are very complex, and multiple kinds of political loyalty, nationality, and multiple levels of wealth among Zainichi Koreans. So we just take Zainichi Koreans as a very diverse group of people, which is not untrue. And in Japanese language, there are also there are even more writings about Zainichi Koreans. There are general survey histories, many versions of it in Japanese. There are many oral history projects. There are writings on Zainichi literature and cinema and memoirs of non-Chonryong people or memoirs by Chonryong people or anti-Chonryong writings and anti-North Korean writings and exposés. And as if these exist, as if there are no centers and no peripheries, and they look like it's a chaotic sort of society. But I think it is helpful to know the power dynamics and power structure that Zainichi society historically shared. So until the 1970s and 80s, Chonryon's power as an establishment was so obvious that no one had to articulate it. But later in our generation, that knowledge is gone. So in order to understand these, different genres of writings, we need some kind of map, I felt. So I wanted to help other people situate a variety of writings that they might encounter through my book. So, in other words, there was an establishment and there were many forms of resistance. And there were also homogenizing forces within Zainichi society. And again, there are many of the resistant forces against it. So this is why the emphasis on diversity became important in the 1980s. Okay, so the other 2 points are quite obvious, and I explain a lot in my book. One is explain Zainichi Koreans' mental and human geographies, and this is not just mental actually, but because Zainichi society had two sides, Chongryon and Mindan, and people, information, and goods actually cut across the very porous border. So Japan itself became a borderland between North and South Korea, and that brought about quite a bit of security concerns and crisis and kidnapping, for example, of Japanese civilians um, that sort of tainted the Japanese post-war period. So I'm trying to also say that we can understand post-war Japan as a post-imperial Japan by highlighting these geographical sort of new understanding through the Zainichi lens, but also to understand how Japanese society was not peaceful, not democratic from many pockets of people. Okay. Well, thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you so much, Sayaka, Yumi.
Thank you, Sayaka, for a really cogent talk. I can't believe you managed to actually summarize the book uh, in just a few minutes. So I have, I think, about 10 minutes. And as the discussant, I really see my role as just launching the broader conversation that we all will have. So please do think of questions that you have from Sayaka's presentation and also the thoughts and questions that I will pose. Um, I I mean, I want to begin by saying that I'm really honored and happy to partake in this celebration, really, of the book. Um, and as those of you who may have been in the room in the first couple minutes, you may have heard Sayaka and me and KumHee catching up because it's been a very long time since we have seen one another. And it actually really draws out a point that is made in the book, which is that there are there are certain kinds of sort of ties and resonances that move through shared kinship, whether that kinship be familial, intellectual, um, and that is something that really brings together researchers, communities, and knowledge production. I'm also really I mean, I've known Sayaka since graduate school, probably since the first day of graduate school for me. And I was just really sort of touched to see in this second book that even though it's a very different topic from her first book, um, she gives us a book in A Nation Within that stays true to her, what I see as her very deep interests in understanding social, emotional, and political dynamics that both forge bonds between people, but also create fissures and conflicts within communities. And so in her first book, and also at the same time, as in her first book, on the mobilization of colonial youth in the Japanese Imperial Army, Sayaka is actually, I think, pretty wary of ideology having much explanatory power. And she is a historian who is fundamentally concerned and interested in explaining how power works. But in the same way that in the first book, that she does not necessarily, I mean, there's a complicated argument in the book, but to say it somewhat reductively, that it's really not, say, Japanese imperial ideology, or in the case of the second book, North Korean socialism, that is giving an organization like Chongryon the kind of influence and power that it has, at least until the 70s or so. Um, I mean, she writes very explicitly about this at the end of chapter 3 when she says that, and I'm partially quoting here, that it's the strong sense of social acceptance and bonding um, among members of the Chongryon community rather than socialist teachings that help sustain the organization Chongryon. So as she pointed out at the beginning of her talk, the book is not about Chongryon, the political organization, but really the community that sustains Chongryon. And these two things are of course interrelated, but also distinct. And in the book, Sayaka explains how it is that it's really the community that is foundational, even as it is very kind of in complex ways shaped by what is happening in the organization. So, and because she's interested in people's sort of situated social, emotional, material, and then in the case of this book, really their spatial lives as well. It, at least to someone like me who has followed her work very closely for a very long time, it was not surprising to see that she does not focus on Chongryon, the institution, or the organization. I've also always thought, although I don't think Sayaka, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think you've always seen yourself as a gender historian. I think you actually have been always a gender historian. I think in the second book, as you say, your feminist sensibilities got more foregrounded. But there is also a similar kind of attention and care to trying to understand, like if in the first book it was about masculinity and different forms of it, this book looks at gender in a more relational way. The last sort of point I'll make about the content of the book before I move on to some questions is that the I think the heart of the book, like the really compelling parts for me, um, were the what I might call the sort of content chapters, which is sort of strange to say because it's all content, but it's uh, chapter 2 on 동네, the third on 학교, and then you go there and you meet the women, you meet the 일꾼, you meet different parts of this very complex Chongryon community that both Sayaka and KumHee have really, I mean, they dedicated years and I'm sure hundreds of hours of talking to folks in this community, which has enabled these sorts of chapters that, as Sayaka herself writes, can give us a sense of what she calls, quote, distinctive mental geographies, end quote. She sometimes refers to these as mental maps. I'll just give you one very specific example. In the 동네 chapter, which I believe it's chapter 2, she writes about the way in which the the community, the Chongryon community, they did not necessarily, I mean, they did not have their own sovereign territory, of course, but they still had a sense of territoriality. And that shared sense of territoriality stemmed from them living in and physically, tangibly experiencing life in 동네. Um, and that and and that it's that sort of consciousness. So I think mental geography or mental map can also sometimes be interchanged with a collective sort of consciousness or shared consciousness. Um, And you get so many of those kinds of moments in each of the middle chapters. Um, that give you a really remarkable and very unexpected sense of what the spaces, what the inhabited spaces, not only what they felt like and how they were experienced by Chongryon community members, but also the political work that those spaces, what they enabled. So if, you know, if time is short, I mean, I mean, it's like no one's going to read just the preface and the prologue. Okay. Like if you, I mean, actually, you can start with those because they'll really pull you in and I mean, make you want to read the rest of the book. But if you are going to dabble in a few chapters, um, go for a chapter, between two and seven. Wait, eight? What's your conclusion is?
8 is very short summary, so yes, 2 to 7.
Through seven, that's right. Um, all right. So those are just my brief thoughts. And I'll move on to some questions. And my questions are also going to kind of integrate a little bit of commentary, I think. And um, the questions really stem from things that I've been thinking about for a long time. And some of the questions are about methodology and your approach. And then other questions are maybe a little bit more specific to your findings, so to speak. But I'll start with a question about approach or method. And that's the language that you use of insider and outsider. And you see yourself as an outsider, you see KumHee as an insider. Uh, and that language really struck me as one of the few moments in which it felt like a very consolidated, like cemented distinction to be made. Like in many other moments, you sort of point out the gray zones. But here with insider and outsider, you really stick with this distinction. And I thought about this in the context of um, some bigger questions I have about what it means to make people's everyday lives into objects of study, such that um, things that would not um, even that someone to use the language of your language of insider outsider, like someone on the inside may not necessarily be able to sort of step back and objectify, right? Like make into an object this thing or this feeling or this relationship in their life. And that has been for so long now a colonial form of knowledge production. This idea that like you have to be objective, it means that you have to be able to stand outside. You have to be able to occupy that outsider position. And that has and that is the premise that has denied um, a form of, sort of intellectual, sort of theoretical capacity, ability, agency on the part of people who are on the inside, so to speak. And um, and so the question, I don't know if there's really a question here, but I just thought I thought it was very interesting that you explained that, and KumHee, you're here, so please, you can obviously feel free to respond too. But I thought it was really interesting that KumHee, at least at the time when you both were maybe deciding about how the book was going to be produced or authored, that she did not necessarily want to make a single kind of analytical claim about such a complicated, multi-layered community. Um, and and I saw in that the a sort of moment where like it made me wonder um, it made me wonder about the many moments in which people like KumHee may have decided, actually, I'm not going to write this, or I'm not going to publish this. But the research that does get published are are by people who might say they are on the outside, so to speak. And so I'm just sort of curious to hear your thoughts on how you how you sort of felt through this as you were doing the research and then also writing, and then also um, when you know the book was about to be published, um, and and whether you think, you know, for instance, like in you make this very clear move that you don't want to necessarily use what you have learned about the Chongryon community as a kind of comparative case with which to make a theoretical claim. Um, and so you don't give us, you don't give that to us in the intro, right? But then you also kind of sneak it in at the end. Um, and you say, well, but I still think that there is a kind of utility here. And so that utility, I just wondered, and I, you know, obviously I understand that there's um that there are our own sort of like in terms of our training, our own sort of institutionalization, like there is of course that urge. Um, but it did again make me think, so is that an impulse that someone who is an insider would have a different relationship to? Like the impulse to try to make a larger claim, to make a historiographical move, so to speak. Okay, long-winded way of just asking you about what it means to do research and how we can do it in a decolonial way. Um, my second question uh, is, is sort of about the book as a whole. So while I was reading, I sense that the book was really prioritizing a kind of pushback against like expose type sensationalistic accounts of Chongryon community members. Like the image of them as like these abjected figures, cultish figures, and that you really wanted to take the lives of the people that you know, spent a lot of time with and that you learned about, that you wanted to explain their lives on their own terms. And I think this is obviously a very important form of kind of resisting or sort of pushing back against sort of more dominant ways of interpreting the Chongryon community. And so your narrative is really focused on things like building stability, creating social bonds. There's that like sort of productive, the emphasis on the productive and the sort of emphasis um, uh, uh, on community formation. Um, but then there are these moments, especially in chapters 3 and 4, about the women's union, or sorry, Hakyo in chapter 3 and women's union in chapter 4, where we see different kinds of violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, bullying, like corporal punishment in the schools, and and you end chapter 4 with uh you end chapter 4 with a quote that made me think that maybe you are actually a little bit unsure about really whether to foreground, say, stability in that chapter. Because at least I sensed that you understood that there were very deep costs to the women as they were doing this work. And so the quote that ends chapter 4 is of one of them saying that when we were doing the work, when we were debating, when we were discussing, we were also always crying. And so I just wondered about, like, yes, the narrative is about showing this sort of like um, showing a kind of decolonial, you know, the Chongryon community members themselves trying to decolonize uh, themselves and building right towards that goal. But then what do we make of the moments in which there is like devastating violence? Okay, last question. I'll be fast. Um, my last question has to do with post-imperial history, in a way. It's sort of a two-part question. One is, do you think that the community that you studied, maybe not the community in 2026, but maybe just in general, thinking of different moments, historical moments, do you think the community would be disturbed or offended by their history being seen as a part of Japanese history? Because you explained to us that there's a very different context for the Chongryon community. This is not a community that wanted to, that actually made a very, they made it a very like strong goal to not become a part of Japanese society, to really actually live in their community and not in Japan, even though they were literally in Japan. And so this is very different from, say, a US context where, it's hard to imagine, for instance, like an indigenous community, indigenous historians or those who work on indigenous history or Black history or women's history saying we do not want to become a part of a critical mainstream, so to speak. So I'm just wondering, part one of the question is, uh, what do you think the response would be to your calls for a post-imperial history? And then the second kind of subset question about post-imperial history is that what you point out in that chat in the last chapter that you are sort of arguing for and that you think that there is a persistence of a quote strong imperial psyche and that basic features of Japan's government and the social system really reflects post-imperial structures. I think this is actually not necessarily uh, a surprising insight to those who have lived in Japan, whether long term or very short term, even for just a few years, as formerly colonized people or descendants of those people. And I think that's why the Chongryon community's decolonization efforts are not necessarily about decolonizing themselves from the empire that they lived in the past, but it's really about decolonizing themselves in the present, right? To create some kind of breathing space in the present empire that they feel around them. And and so that I think is a kind of sensibility that that many in the Korean diaspora at large, beyond Chongryon, that is something that is not surprising to sort of feel Japan as a post-imperial space. But what is new and what is different is that your book, um, I think, along with some others that have come out recently, on histories of like immigration and border control, that altogether that your sort of collective scholarship is helping to shed light on a post-imperial condition that takes seriously the role of racialization and the creation of a racial regime, um, that undergirds, that really conditions a kind of state violence. And I think, I don't know if he's still in the audience, but there's a UCLA graduate student in history, Chol Namgong. Namgong is his last name. Um, and he's writing his dissertation precisely about this. And so it's really exciting to me that your work, his work, and others are helping to articulate something that I think has felt perhaps obvious to many of us, but hasn't quite been articulated fully and collectively. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Yumi, for reading it so closely. And I tried to address some of the issues that you raised very astutely. Okay, so first of all, the cemented binary of outsider, insider, and whether that binary might recreate the colonial form of knowledge production, that they have to be objective, that therefore have to be outsiders to write about this community. Um, so this has been in my mind for the longest time since I started this, and this is partly why I resisted writing this book until KumHee persuaded me. Um, so I see my role as an outsider not as an objective person, but an ignorant person to the community. But also there is I see myself as an interpreter. So actually, Kumi was an interpreter for me, and I'm the interpreter for a larger audience. That's how I see our roles are. And obviously, there is very, as you say, there's a gray zone. So this is why the chapter on Japanese women in the family is important for me because they are the ones they decided to become part of, well, they happen to be part of the community, and they had to make a decision or not make a decision to so that the community can hold on to their ideology or identity or political activism. So I I hopefully I don't my book is not giving sense that this you have to be an outsider to write this. But I that's not what I meant by saying I'm an outsider. And but I do feel that from the insider's point of view, community members' point of view, there is certain boundary. And if the outsiders like myself do not have that boundary, I still feel that they do have one that would exclude, people from outside in sharing information, sharing their emotions, just because it's just hard to explain in one encounter. And I'm sure there are a number of Japanese people who taught in Hakkyo for long years, or they have associations with them, and some of them might have crossed that, insider-outsider boundary. And I have met a number of Japanese people, like in Nagasaki or in Hyogo, and they really worked together with Chongryon communities. They do not necessarily see themselves as part of the community, but they totally understand and honor the boundary that they want to maintain. So I also want to honor that, that sense of the protective shell. And yeah, that's how I feel. And as we all know, there's no objective. This is so me, right? The book is so me writing it, and there's no claim of being objective. I'm sure there are many different versions. You could write with the same material. Um, so I don't think objectivity was at stake when I say insider, outsider. It's more of an interpretation. So yes, utility. So the another thing that I was worried about is to find the utility in this history for my own sake or for Japanese historians' own sake. And to answer your one of the last questions, whether the community would be offended by including this in post-imperial history, absolutely. They will probably don't see the point of the first they might not get offended. There are a variety of writings, academic writings, and even coming from inside, those who grew up in the community and became professors outside, and they write critically about the community as well. However, I don't think the community has a strong objection about being studied that way and being presented that way. But I don't think they get the point. Like, why would you want to include us in the Japanese politics, right? Like, there's no point of doing that. So again, in introduction, I state that, or maybe in my preface, that Chonryong people would be puzzled, but I just had this urge. Once you understand, once you learn something about Chonryong, it's very difficult to undo, right? And to look at Japanese society in the same way. So I thought I I wanted to end the story, the book, before the conclusion, but at the same time, I would be so frustrated if someone else would just keep ignoring this community in writing Japanese post-war history. So I might as well write a version of it from my, with my background knowledge. And this is the sort of, the proposal, so to speak. Um, yeah, that's what I tried to do. Um, and also thank you for pointing out the post-imperial psyche. Yes, it has been there, and it's that the continuity of empire itself, imperialism itself is not new. There is mentioning of, studies of Okinawa, studies of Ainu women, or from many angles. It's clear. However, as you say, articulating some of the legal setting and I think Chonryong was really big in politics. So what they did and didn't do affected how other minorities acted in post-war Japan and how the way you felt about sort of being, subjectified or being oppressed or surveilled. Um, had a lot to do with how Chonryong also decided to leave the fight against that post-imperial polity. So that's something I wanted to point out. So this is not necessarily just about oppression, but how the Chonryong played certain ironic role in semi-perpetuating the system as well. And this sounds like I'm blaming the victim, but it's but I think because Chonryong was by no means a subaltern, powerless entity, I want to put the power in the right historical place as well. Yeah, I stop here maybe, and if there are questions, or Kumi, do you want to say something about insider, outsider binary?
Yeah, insider, outsider, things like, yeah, we always use this term all the time. But sometimes the Chongryon community is really close to society. And then the school, hakyo, why we say the hakyo in Korean term instead of just school, because the whole meaning of it, this hakyo is reproducing cultural, belief, knowledge, value, everything. So even we had an experience one time, Sayaka, you remember that we interviewed the Byunjin. He's really against North Korea, against Chongryon, and Chongryon people hate it. However, when we meet and start talking, he is a Chongryon person after all because he graduated from Chongryon school. The cultural, like how we share the value, how I started talking to him, I use my Chongryon school cultural like approach. He felt comfortable with that. He felt much closer to with that. So interesting thing is Yumi really say what was correlated but distinct about Chongryon institution. This is exactly what's happening because of a school. School itself be creating community, and then therefore this is so powerful that Chongryon institution still exist. And then, but still distinct because many, Sayaka heard us, many complain they hate Chongryon so much. For example, my many friends' father who passed away, like that best friend too, he hates North Korea, he hates Chongryon. However, he really proud of himself that he sent his kids from kindergarten to university. This is really contradiction, but it's not for Chonryong people. This is telling that what is mean the outsider, insider. It's not like just boundary, but even for example, Mindan people became outsider too, because Minna who didn't go to Korean school that never shared this value. So we have to see that this outsider, insider, when we use this term, is a slightly different way of we're using that. Does it make sense in that way? Yeah.